Sargent Claude Johnson was an artist in a period we would consider the Harlem Renaissance, but he wasn't based in Harlem, New York. He was based on the West Coast.
And even though he didn't actually live in Harlem, he was certainly informed by the ideas that were happening in Harlem. Celebrating an artist like him and what he had to do to try to get credibility, to make these works, to be represented in Harlem, even though he's living in California. It's a story that we need to hear.
Sargent Claude Johnson was born in Boston. He was orphaned as a young boy. He went to art school in San Francisco and became a very important artist of his generation.
A way you might get to know an artist like Johnson is through looking at his family history. Sargent Johnson's artistic education may have started actually by looking at his aunt's sculptures. His aunt was a prominent African-American artist named May Howard Jackson. It's thought that that may have been some of his early inspiration. He does spend some time in his early childhood living with his uncle and aunt. Because his uncle was successful, he was able to have access to really great boarding schools. And so that education ultimately opens up opportunities. He does study music. That influence of music certainly does come up later in his work.
In the beginning, he was part of what we would think of today as the Harlem Renaissance. Then he worked for the Harmon Foundation in New York, which was an organization devoted to celebrating the artistic works of Black artists. Then he also works for the Works Progress Administration, which is a government-sponsored program to support artists during the Great Depression era.
Alan Locke was a philosopher. He was very much interested in changing the perception about how African Americans were perceived. This is still a time period where there are caricature images and there are all types of representations of Black people that are demeaning and degrading. He really saw art as the mode to kind of push his philosophy forward. If you're making a statement that like, hey, we need to change the way we're being viewed, you might want to get an artist to help you because they actually know how to make and create images. Johnson was a biracial man. And so by all physical means, he could have denied his Black identity. I think he saw in Locke's ideology a space for him to actually accept his Blackness, and it gave him that sense of agency to do something about it. Philosophers like Alan Locke influence artists to think about, well, how am I being represented and how can I be an agent of change and create images that would change how others see me.
Alain Locke was encouraging Black artists in the United States to look to Africa for influence for their new modern works, and Johnson does this in a number of different ways. First is the representation of his figures, and the second way is his use of materials that in many ways recall traditional arts from Africa. For example, hand-hammered copper, or the use of terracotta ceramics, or wood carving. And these are all materials that Johnson used in his own works of the 1920s and 30s. He was strongly influenced by the art of the Mexican modernists like Diego Rivera, who was working in San Francisco in the 1930s. And then in the 1940s, Johnson travels a number of times to Mexico. He goes to the museums, he meets other contemporary artists in Mexico. He also travels to Oaxaca in southern Mexico and works with indigenous potters, and a number of the pieces that Sargent Johnson made during this era were actually fired in the kilns in Oaxaca.
Johnson was very much influenced by different cultures, different artistic traditions, Greek, Mesoamerica, Egyptian. In addition to that, there were many different modern artists of different backgrounds that he was being influenced by in San Francisco. He's seeing Diego Rivera. He's seeing modernists from various traditions in his city as well. Sargent Claude Johnson is an artist that truly embraces his identity. And then he also has the presence of mind to say, I also am not limited to that, and I can be influenced and inspired by all kinds of things. We can look at his story and say, what am I missing out on that I haven't tried? That type of daring boldness to do what you feel. And I think that's what he represents.